There's something about a man who smiles at everyone and trusts no one. Dean Martin was that man. To the world, he was the coolest guy in any room. Smooth voice, easy laugh, a glass of something amber always nearby. But behind that famous grin lived one of Hollywood's sharpest minds. A man who watched, who remembered, and who, in quiet moments with people he trusted, told the truth about some of the biggest names who ever walked under studio lights. What he saw wasn't pretty. Dean spent decades inside the machine. He performed alongside legends, shared stages with icons, and broke bread with people whose faces filled movie screens across America. And what he discovered again and again was that the distance between who these people appeared to be and who they actually were could be vast, sometimes frighteningly so. This is the story of 10 Hollywood names that Dean Martin privately considered among the most genuinely dangerous, dishonest, or morally corrupt figures he ever encountered. Not difficult personalities, not artistic eccentrics. People whose behavior, in his estimation, crossed into something darker. Something that the industry's powerful machinery worked hard to hide from the public that adored them. Let's start at the beginning, with a man who built an entire career playing lovable roughnecks with hearts of gold, while reportedly being neither lovable nor golden in any meaningful sense. Wallace Beery stood over 6 feet tall and weighed somewhere around 250 pounds. In the 1930s and early 1940s, that imposing frame was used to great effect in films where he played gruff but tender father figures, broken down heroes and sentimental brutes who ultimately did the right thing. Audiences loved him for it. MGM counted on him. And for years, that commercial value served as an invisible shield around a man who, by multiple accounts, was a genuine bully. Physically intimidating, casually racist, and according to those who knew Dean Martin personally, possibly complicit in something far worse. Martin reportedly described Beery with one simple damning phrase: a pig who got away with everything. That assessment wasn't about rudeness on a film set. It wasn't about a star demanding extra perks or throwing his weight around with directors. Martin's deeper concern was tied to the death of Ted Healy, the comedian who originally created the Three Stooges, who died in 1937 after sustaining severe injuries outside a Hollywood nightclub. The official version attributed Healy's death to complications from his heavy drinking. But for decades, people inside the industry whispered a different story. A story that put Beery, along with others, at the scene of a brutal beating. A story that suggested MGM's fixers had worked the phones, pressured witnesses, and quietly shaped the narrative to protect one of their most bankable stars. Whether every detail of that account is provable today is almost beside the point. What matters is what it reveals about the system. A system that Martin watched with clear eyes for many years. A system that could decide a man's life was worth less than a box office draw. Beyond the Healy allegations, Beery's day-to-day behavior on set was well documented in its cruelty. He used his size to dominate scenes in ways that had nothing to do with talent. Blocking fellow actors from camera angles, deliberately disrupting their close-up takes, stepping on their dialogue. Small, calculated acts of sabotage dressed up as professional competition. For Martin, Beery represented something almost foundational. The original proof that Hollywood could dress up a monster in charm and studio lighting and sell him to the world as something warm and human. Now consider the gap between a voice and the man behind it. Bing Crosby's voice was, by any measure, one of the great instruments of the 20th century. Warm, unhurried, perfectly shaped for both a Christmas carol and a quiet summer evening. Crosby became something more than a star. He became a cultural comfort, a reassurance, a feeling of safety given a melody. Dean Martin reportedly called him ice. That single word carries everything. Because what emerged after Crosby's death, largely through the devastating memoir written by his son Gary, was a portrait of a father who had built a trophy room in his own home specifically to serve as the location where he would beat his children. A man who monitored his son's weight and punished them for gaining even a single pound beyond what he deemed acceptable. A man who demanded they emerge from punishment without tears, composed as if nothing had happened. Martin had children of his own. He was, by every account from those who knew him, a genuinely affectionate father. The idea that someone could deploy warmth and patience and gentle humor on screen could literally become America's favorite father figure, while running a household on fear and physical punishment struck him as something beyond ordinary hypocrisy. It felt, in his estimation, like a kind of fraud, not just on his family, but on the millions of people who trusted that voice, who let it into their living rooms and believed in what it seemed to represent. What disturbed Martin most, according to those close to him, wasn't even the abuse itself, as horrifying as it was. It was the apparent satisfaction Crosby seemed to take in the distance between his two lives, the warmth he performed publicly, and the control he exercised privately. Some people are simply different behind closed doors. But the suggestion here was that Crosby actually enjoyed the contradiction. That's a different thing entirely. If you found this journey through Hollywood's hidden history compelling so far, please share it with someone who loves classic films. They might never look at these old legends quite the same way again. Errol Flynn was perhaps the most visually perfect movie star who ever lived. The bone structure, the athletic grace, the easy smile that seemed to say adventure was just around the corner. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, he was cinema itself, the embodiment of heroism, daring, and romantic possibility. Martin's private assessment was direct. You didn't want your sister anywhere near him. Flynn's name became permanently attached to a particular kind of reckless charm. There's even an old expression built around it. But the reality beneath that charm was far less glamorous. In 1943, he faced 2 separate criminal trials for statutory rape involving underage girls. He was acquitted both times, and Hollywood breathed a collective sigh of relief. The machinery kept running. The films kept coming. But the acquittals didn't change the pattern. Multiple women described experiences with Flynn that went well beyond the era's already permissive standards. Encounters marked by manipulation, coercion, and a profound disregard for whether the other person was actually willing. Flynn moved through the world as though consent were an optional formality, and the studio system treated his behavior the same way, as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a harm to be stopped. What made this particularly sharp for Martin was the specific roles Flynn kept playing. He spent his career portraying freedom fighters, noble defenders of justice, men who stood against oppression and protected the vulnerable. Simultaneously, according to FBI documents that emerged later, he was under investigation for potential ties to fascist organizations. This while playing heroes fighting Nazi Germany on screen. The gap between the symbol and the man wasn't just large. It was almost comically inverted. By the time Flynn died at 50, his body had aged well beyond his years. The beauty that had once been his greatest asset had been consumed by decades of hard living. For those who had watched him closely, that physical deterioration seemed less like tragedy than like a visible reckoning. The outside finally catching up with what had long been true on the inside. Not every form of evil announces itself with violence. Some of it comes dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, speaking in measured tones, doing enormous damage with quiet efficiency. Adolphe Menjou was one of Hollywood's most polished supporting actors. Continental, sophisticated, the kind of man who seemed born to play diplomats and aristocrats. On screen, he radiated civility. Off-screen, during the darkest period of Hollywood's Cold War paranoia, he was one of the most enthusiastic participants in the systematic destruction of his colleagues' livelihoods. Martin reportedly said that Menjou was someone who ruined people with a smile. The House Un-American Activities Committee investigations of the late 1940s and early 1950s tore through Hollywood like a blade. Careers ended. Lives were upended. People who had done nothing more than hold certain political views, or know people who had, found themselves blacklisted, unemployable, their names poisoned. And Menjou didn't just cooperate with this process, he embraced it. He testified eagerly as a friendly witness, served on the board of organizations that actively promoted the purging of suspected communists, and by multiple accounts, seemed to genuinely enjoy his role in the proceedings. Director Joseph Mankiewicz described him in blunt terms. Lauren Bacall, who watched the blacklist consume people she loved, counted Menjou among the first and most willing informers. What gave Martin particular pause was his own position in all of this. He wasn't a political man. He didn't run with the liberal Hollywood crowd that became the blacklist's primary target. But he also had no sympathy for those who used fear and accusation as weapons. From that neutral vantage point, his judgment of Menjou wasn't ideological. It was moral. Here was a man using the trust his elegant persona inspired to lend credibility to a process that destroyed real people, often on evidence that wouldn't survive 10 minutes of honest scrutiny. The smile that stayed in place while careers crumbled. That was what Martin couldn't forgive. No one on Martin's private list gave him a more direct, personal window into someone's true character than Jerry Lewis. They were partners for a decade. Not casual colleagues. Genuine partners, performing together night after night, sharing dressing rooms, traveling together, building something that became one of the most successful acts in American entertainment history. Martin saw Lewis at every hour, in every mood, under every kind of pressure. And what he reportedly saw beneath the manic energy and the childlike persona that audiences adored was something he later described with stark simplicity. The public loved the clown. I lived with the tyrant. Lewis presented himself to the world as pure, uninhibited comedy, spontaneous, childlike, unfiltered. The reality, visible to anyone who worked closely with him, was the opposite. He was a meticulous controller, calculating every aspect of their shared performances with precision, gradually reshaping the act in ways that pushed Martin toward the margins. By the time the partnership ended, bitterly, in 1956, Martin had spent years watching Lewis use charm as a public mask while exercising something very different with the people who actually worked for him. Crew members, camera operators, makeup artists, production assistants, particularly women. Multiple accounts describe Lewis reducing people to tears through public humiliation, making demeaning comments that served no creative purpose beyond establishing dominance. The behavior was an occasional frustration under pressure. It seemed to be something he enjoyed, a need to see fear in the people around him. What complicated this picture, and what Martin reportedly found particularly troubling, was Lewis's extraordinary public work on behalf of children with muscular dystrophy. For decades, he hosted one of the most watched charity telethons in television history, weeping openly for children in need, clearly moved, clearly genuine in that emotion. And then, off camera, he could turn and be viciously cruel to a young production assistant in the same hour. That capacity to feel something so real in one direction while treating real people nearby with contempt. That was the thing Martin could never square. Their relationship never fully healed. The famous brief reunion in the 1970s was orchestrated from the outside, not grown from within. The wounds were too old and too specific. George C. Scott gave some of the most powerful performances in the history of American cinema. His work was undeniable. Martin acknowledged that much. He also reportedly said that you don't play a character like Patton unless some part of you is already living in that territory. Scott's volatility was legendary on set. Not the theatrical storms of an actor protecting their process. Genuine explosions, physically threatening, unpredictable in their timing and targets. Walls punched. Furniture thrown. Directors and fellow actors subjected to intimidation that had nothing to do with artistic disagreement. His alcoholism fed the fire, but the fire existed independently of the drinking. What made Scott particularly difficult for those around him wasn't the explosions themselves. It was the impossibility of predicting them. He could be brilliant, warm, and intellectually engaging for hours, then shift without warning into something genuinely frightening. Everyone on his sets existed in a low-level state of anxiety, never certain what would trigger the next eruption. This extended to his personal life. His relationship with actress Colleen Dewhurst, marked by repeated separations and reconciliations, mirrored the pattern he brought to work. Intense, volatile, sometimes dangerous. Martin had worked with difficult people his entire career. He had no particular expectation of easy collaborators, but Scott, in his estimation, represented something different. A man who had decided his talent entitled him to exemption from basic consideration for others. In an industry that agreed. Because the performances were extraordinary enough that everyone accommodated what came with them, rather than holding him accountable. That accommodation was its own kind of problem. It told Scott, repeatedly, that no cost was too high for others to pay in exchange for his art. Spencer Tracy is perhaps the clearest example of how powerfully Hollywood could construct and maintain an image of moral authority around a man whose private behavior directly contradicted everything that image represented. On screen, Tracy was conscience itself. Naturalistic, grounded, projecting the kind of quiet decency that made audiences trust him completely. 9 Academy Award nominations. 2 consecutive wins. A man whose acting style was so understated that he made it look like not acting at all. Martin's private assessment was pointed. He could charm a crowd and break someone's jaw an hour later. Tracy's alcoholism was not a secret. Not to anyone who knew him. But what the public didn't see, and what the studio machinery worked carefully to suppress, were the episodes of violence that accompanied his drinking. Women in particular were reportedly subjected to physical harm during his worst periods. Behavior that was consistently framed as the tragic side effect of a disease rather than what it actually was. Abuse. Katharine Hepburn, who spent decades as his partner and who was one of the most capable and formidable women in Hollywood history, remained publicly devoted to him through all of it. The studio supported the fiction of Tracy's marriage while enabling the reality of his relationship with Hepburn. Everyone managed the story. Everyone protected the image. What struck Martin most wasn't even Tracy's personal failures. Alcoholism is a genuine illness, and Martin's generation understood that. It was the comprehensive machinery of protection that surrounded Tracy. The witnesses who went quiet, the incidents that disappeared, the saintly public image that remained spotless regardless of what happened behind closed doors. That machinery required a lot of people making a lot of choices. And every one of those choices said that Tracy's image mattered more than the people he harmed. That's not just one man's problem, that's a system's problem, and Martin had watched that system operate for a very long time. Sterling Hayden had everything required to be one of the great leading men of his generation. The physical presence. 6'5", ruggedly compelling. Combined with genuine talent that surfaced memorably in films spanning multiple decades. The Asphalt Jungle. The Killing. The Godfather. Dr. Strangelove. A range that most actors would spend entire careers working toward. Martin's assessment of Hayden was tinged with something close to frustrated sadness. He could have been great if he didn't want to fight everyone. The fighting was real and chronic. Directors, producers, fellow actors. Anyone who, in Hayden's increasingly paranoid reading of events, seemed to be working against him or undermining his performance. His substance use, heavy marijuana consumption alongside significant drinking, amplified tendencies that likely existed independently, creating a working environment where everyone walked carefully around a man who could shift from engaged to explosive with little warning. Some of Hayden's paranoia had genuine roots. His experience as an OSS operative during World War II, his brief Communist Party membership and subsequent cooperation with HUAC. Cooperation he later deeply and publicly regretted, gave him legitimate reasons to feel surveilled and judged. His life had been genuinely complicated in ways most people's lives are not. But the cost of his internal battles was paid by everyone around him, productions destabilized, shoots disrupted by disappearances or unauthorized script changes. The intimidation of his physical size pressed into service not for any creative purpose, but simply to create fear. What Martin found difficult to excuse was the selfishness of it, the apparent indifference to how his chaos affected people with no power to protect themselves from it. A director could push back with difficulty. Production assistant could not. The talent was real. The waste of it was just as real. And for Martin, who prized professionalism and considered reliability a form of respect for everyone on a set, Hayden's career represented a specific kind of loss. Not just his own, but everyone who deserved better. Robert Mitchum's particular brand of cinematic cool has never quite been replicated. The hooded eyes, the economy of movement, the suggestion of depths that the camera could almost but never fully reach. In film noir, he was essentially irreplaceable. A man who seemed to have already seen everything terrible the world could offer and arrived at a kind of weary peace with it. Martin respected the craft. He reportedly never trusted the man. What separated Mitchum, in the eyes of those who worked with him, from the standard typical Hollywood star was a coldness that seemed to run beneath everything. A genuine absence of empathy that his coolness on screen could sometimes glamorize, but that in person read as something far less appealing. His treatment of people with less industry power was a particular concern. His famous on-set pranks were known for crossing the line from tension-relieving mischief into deliberate humiliation, targeted with what seemed like surgical precision at someone's actual vulnerabilities rather than their surface quirks. Mitchum's famous comment that acting was the easiest job since stealing captured something real about how he viewed both his work and the people who watched it. There was a cynicism there that went beyond the standard performer's private skepticism about show business. It suggested a contempt for the audience's belief, for the emotional investment the job asked of others, for the whole enterprise of being seen and trusted. Martin had come up through enough hard rooms to have his own brand of toughness, but he had never stopped genuinely engaging with the people around him. The distance between his warmth and Mitchum's cold remove wasn't just temperamental. It reflected something deeper about how each man understood what they owed the world. And finally, the one that Martin reportedly said gave him the creeps long before anyone else was paying attention. Robert Blake was a genuinely talented actor. His early work as a child performer, his remarkable turn in Cold Blood, his long run on the television series that made him a household name. There was real ability there, visible and specific, but those who encountered him consistently described something else alongside the talent. A volatility that exceeded professional temperament, a rage that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep and unresolved, producing reactions wildly out of proportion to whatever had triggered them. Martin made his assessment quietly to people he trusted. That man gave me the creeps long before any of the trials. The instability was well documented within the industry long before it became public knowledge. Productions around Blake existed in a state of managed tension. Crew members reported genuine anxiety about physical safety. Not concern about having a bad day on set, but real apprehension. Network executives repeatedly intervened to smooth over conflicts, essentially teaching Blake that his behavior had no ceiling, that stardom was a full indemnity against consequence, that pattern of accommodation. The industry's refusal to hold someone accountable because they were commercially valuable was something Martin had watched repeat itself throughout his entire career in Hollywood. Different names, same machinery, same choice made, again and again, to protect the product over the people. In 2001, Blake's wife was found shot to death in their car outside a Los Angeles restaurant. He was tried for murder, acquitted in criminal court, and later found liable for her wrongful death in a civil proceeding. The story dominated headlines for years. For people who had watched Blake up close for decades, it was not entirely a surprise. The warning signs had been visible for a long time. They had simply been treated as acceptable costs of doing business. What runs through every story on this list is something larger than any one person's character. It's the story of a system. Powerful, profitable, and deeply invested in the stories it told about itself and the people it protected. A system that decided repeatedly and deliberately that image was worth more than truth, and that a star's commercial value was sufficient justification for looking away from almost anything. Dean Martin watched all of it. He smiled his famous smile, held his glass, and kept his thoughts largely to himself, except in private with people he trusted, where a different picture emerged. A man who had measured the distance between Hollywood's myths and Hollywood's realities and found it vast. He named 10. There were likely more. But these 10, in his estimation, represented the full range of what the machine could produce and protect. From physical violence to cold manipulation, from predatory behavior to the quiet destruction of lives done with a smile and a briefcase full of names. Classic Hollywood gave us extraordinary art. It also gave us extraordinary cover. Understanding both is how we see it clearly. Not through nostalgia, not through cynicism, but through honest attention to what was actually there. This look behind the curtain of Hollywood's golden age stayed with you. Please share it. Like this, if you believe the full story, not just the glamorous version, deserves to be told. And stay with us. There are more stories where this one came from. Stories that remind us that the most powerful myths are always the ones with the most to hide.